So I'm just going to give you a wee bit of an overview, just a wee bit of background about myself, first of all. Deputy Head Teacher in Dunfermline High School 3 and 5. Prior to that, I was Principal Teacher of Social Subjects, and my own background is as a teacher of Modern Studies and of History. So there'll be a wee bit of crossover with what Gemma was saying earlier on, because I'm really going to speak through the prism of social subjects and just try to give you a bit of an overview of where elements of migration fit into that jigsaw as part of the Scottish curriculum. So those are the kind of things I'm going to talk about, how it's approached in schools, what are some of the challenges, but it will be through that prism by and large. I'll talk a bit about how it fits into the broad general education, S1 to S3, where social studies really splits into these different strands. Then into the senior phase, there's actually more than 3 subjects in the senior phase in social studies, but the 3 most popular, the 3 most well-known ones are geography, history, and modern studies. And for those of you who are unaware, modern studies is a uniquely Scottish subject. It's been around for over 50 years now. It's primarily politics, but it does have a degree of sociology and does have a degree of economics in it. And if any of you are sitting wondering who the politician in charge of Scottish education was in 1987, as Louise Glenn said earlier on, I have double checked, and it was Ian Lang, who was the Under Secretary of State for Scotland at the time. So he would have held the brief in education. So being a modern studies and history teacher, that's the kind of geeky stuff that she knows I'm interested in. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview. I'm going to talk a wee bit about some challenges as well. But when I was thinking about migration in schools, I think in common with a few other speakers today, I did think about some of my own experiences. I've been really lucky over the last few years. I've had the opportunity to go and engage in education systems in quite a few different countries in the world, notably the United States, Germany and France, and to an extent the Netherlands as well. And there's just a few photographs here of a couple of different schools in the United States. And I wasn't going with an eye to look specifically at how migration is looked at in the US. But every high school I've been in, every middle school I've been in the United States has a corridor like this main hallway you can see here. That's a school in Washington, DC, but it's got flags up there representing the birthplace of every student that they've got in the high school. Similarly, that photograph there with the Statue of Liberty, students from all over the world attend, that's a middle school in Denver in Colorado. And again, we had that very, very visible emphasis upon the background in terms of migration of pupils to the school. It was very different when I was in Germany, for example. A couple of years ago, I spent a bit of time in a few schools in Bavaria, not in big cities, not in Munich, but in a couple of towns, Straubing and Landshut in Bavaria. And interestingly, there spent time in some schools where there was quite a high proportion of Syrian refugee pupils in the school as well. So in a different way, there was quite an emphasis in those schools, not only upon the background of some of the students they had in school, but with their curriculum as well. And I suppose that really made me think a bit about what's the visibility and celebration of migration school life here in Scotland? Is that so clear in Scotland? And that will vary from school to school. And there's perhaps been a bit of an allusion to that already. There's been a bit of chat about schools in Glasgow and in comparison with schools in Fife. The picture will vary from school to school, but I'm just going to try and give you a bit of an overview as to how the curriculum may or may not equip young people in Scotland. So moving on to the broad general education, there's 3 strands here: people, place, environment, people, past, events and societies, and people in society, economy and business. These are the social studies in S1 to S3, and different schools will study these range of different elements of social studies to a different extent. But there is some reference to migration in some way, shape or form in each of the social studies here. So I've just picked out an example here from people, place and environment, and that would eventually lead into geography in the senior phase in S4 to S6. Pupils studying that element of social studies as part of their BGE would be expected to have a bit of an understanding of the interdependence of countries, to be able to understand a bit about population structures in Scotland and in comparison with somewhere else. Just as we've heard a speaker talk about today, it's not the nature of the Scottish curriculum means that you aren't, given a big book to look at and said you must study this, you must study this, you must study this. But this guidance here, these benchmarks here, do make it clear to social studies practitioners they must be looking at this to some extent. Similarly, moving on to people, past events and societies, which would eventually lead into history, it actually gets a bit more specific there in the guidance to teachers and the benchmarks, that you should be looking in some way at the impact of migration upon Scotland and upon migrants coming into Scotland. And lastly, moving into people and society, economy and business, some of which would become modern studies, not all. There's talk there of multiculturalism, and the example that they give is immigration. So if we're thinking of this jigsaw, you can see that a young person working through their broad general education, once they get into the secondary stage, so S1 to S3, should have some degree of understanding of migration across the board. It should have filtered into their curriculum in some way, shape or form. The extent to which that happens will change from school to school. But I noticed that one of our colleagues who put in the chat earlier on, she had to leave. She actually had a question for Gemma about, does the study of migration end at 1939? You might have an experience in the broad general education where it doesn't necessarily end at 1939. You could be looking at contemporary migration. If we move into the senior phase, that's where, as I say, there's a few subjects actually in social studies, but these are the three most well-known ones. And I'm not going to linger on these, but I've just got extracts here from National 5, and then the right-hand side from Higher for geography from the course assessment specification. And you can see there an expectation that young people, that candidates for an SQA exam or SQA qualifications would be looking at global issues, and depending upon what context their school chose to study, they would be looking at elements of migration to some extent, depending on what they've studied. If a young person chose to study history, then obviously we've heard quite a bit today already about migration and empire. So I think my take on it, looking at the overview here of the three social studies subjects, history is very much where you would have the biggest and most in-depth study of migration. And obviously Gemma's told us a bit about that already. When you get into modern studies, and I've just got an exemplar there from the National 5, you've got three broad themes, none of which mention migration specifically, but most candidates doing modern studies would look at it to some extent. It may come up as an example if when they're studying Scottish and UK democracy. It may be a group they're looking at when they're looking at section 2 about social issues, or it may be in international issues. You may have some schools may choose to study the political and international ramifications of migration as a political issue. What's more common is, though, that schools would choose to do a case study of a country, and the vast majority of schools study the United States of America, and the study of migration or immigration into the US and the experience of immigrants thereafter is quite a substantial chunk there of US politics and social study. So I think that leaves us with three implications there, and this is just, I was in my school earlier on, and I just popped into a couple of classrooms to take photographs of some stuff that was in the walls. Most modern studies pupils will have a good understanding of migration. If you've chosen to study modern studies in the senior phase, you'll have a good understanding of the principles around migration, politics and immigration in the modern world, but it will be in the United States. It won't necessarily be in Scotland. Students who've chosen to study history, a significant proportion of them will have had an understanding of Scottish immigrants and emigrants, as we've heard today. But again, that ends there in 1939. So a big question I'm just going to put out there as an unanswered question is, does that senior phase give our pupils a good enough understanding of migration as a contemporary Scottish issue, if we look at it through the lens of these three national qualifications? Briefly moving on, obviously not every pupil would study one of these, but to be honest, virtually every pupil in Scotland does study at least one of the social studies at National 5 level. Smaller numbers will go on to a higher level, but you can see there from 2019, all three of those do feature in the top 10 most studied hires there. So they are very widely studied across the country. Obviously, as we've heard about today and spoken about today, I mean, social studies do not have a monopoly on looking at migration, but they would have a look at a lot of the political and sociological ramifications of it. But there's a range of other areas that it's been looked at. And obviously further to that, and as Maria was talking about as well, we've got the fact that one of the 4 capacities of the Curriculum for Excellence is about building responsible citizens. And I just want to look at one particular policy that I think is very relevant there, and that is every school's requirement to build political literacy in their students. That doesn't just refer to students who might be studying modern studies or might be studying history or might have looked at a particularly politically engaging novel in English, for example. Every pupil who comes through a Scottish secondary school is supposed to have a certain degree of political literacy, and there's big challenges in terms of how we deliver that. I've highlighted a couple of points there in red from the policy, and one there is about critical thinking skills, and it's about an ability to look, at information, to be able to make assessments of big issues, big concerns that are going on without resorting to hyperbole. And it's the importance of that in the kind of society that we're trying to build. And I think where that particularly has an impact on Scotland, and again I would think back to looking at what's happening in the US and looking at what's happening in Germany and the Netherlands, and I'm not raising them as examples because I'm saying they're doing it right and we're doing it wrong. That's literally just places I have been that have been talking about migration. Where that's important, I think, is where we apply it in a Scottish context. The political literacy information makes clear that the context for this literacy is heightened when there's a major issue. And I think there's no doubt that migration has been a major issue in Scottish and UK politics and in the media. And just as one example there, for example, very, migration's never been far from the front pages. And I've just dropped that wee quote there from a study from the Cardiff School of Journalism a few years ago about the extent to which migration has been weaponized by the media here in Scotland and in the United Kingdom. And again, the reason I'm referring to that is if we look at why we have a policy on political literacy, one of those things is clearly about equipping our students to be able to assess issues around migration and other political issues without resorting to this kind of hyperbole and being able to assess genuine critical thinking to it. So big challenges there, I think, for the Scottish education system, for the Scottish curriculum. I'm certainly not suggesting I have any answers to that question I've got up there that I could very quickly summarise, but I hope that I've tried to give you some form of overview there of a jigsaw of how it fits into social studies, and then how that social studies jigsaw fits into the wider curriculum just there as well. That's me.